For decades, one simple assumption shaped the North American oil market. Canada would always have one customer it could never afford to lose, and American refiners knew it. They built billion-dollar facilities around Canadian heavy crude, negotiated from a position of strength, and benefited from a system that left Canada with very few alternatives. But that assumption is now being tested. Quietly, without dramatic headlines or overnight disruption, Canada has begun taking steps that could gradually change one of the longest-standing relationships in the global energy business. The shift is not complete, and it won't happen overnight. But for the first time in generations, U.S. refiners are being forced to consider a future in which Canadian oil is no longer automatically headed south. The question is no longer whether Canada wants more options. The question is whether those options can become reality before the next major trade dispute changes the rules once again. To understand why this moment matters, you first have to understand how unusual Canada's position has been for most of the modern energy era. Canada is one of the world's largest oil-producing countries. Its proven oil reserves rank among the biggest anywhere on Earth, and the overwhelming majority of those reserves sit beneath Alberta's oil sands. On paper, that sounds like the foundation for enormous economic leverage. Countries with abundant natural resources often have the ability to choose among competing buyers, negotiate favorable prices, and diversify their export markets. Yet Canada's experience has been remarkably different. For decades, geography shaped nearly every major decision the country's energy sector made. Most Canadian oil infrastructure was built to move production south into the United States rather than west toward the Pacific or east toward overseas markets. Pipelines connected Alberta's oil fields directly to American refining centers, creating one of the most integrated energy relationships anywhere in the world. At first, that arrangement appeared to benefit both countries. Canada gained a reliable customer located right next door. American refiners secured a dependable source of heavy crude that matched the design of many of their facilities. Investments worth billions of dollars flowed into refineries capable of processing Canadian oil, strengthening a partnership that became deeper with every passing decade. But there was another side to the story that attracted far less attention. Canadian producers gradually found themselves relying on a single dominant market. When almost every export pipeline points toward one country, negotiating power naturally shifts toward the buyer. If producers have limited alternatives, buyers know they are unlikely to walk away from the table. Over time, this dynamic became one of the defining characteristics of North America's oil trade. The result was a pricing gap that became familiar across the industry. Canadian heavy crude often sold below major international benchmarks, not necessarily because the oil was of poor quality, but because transportation constraints limited where it could be sold. Analysts repeatedly argued that the discount reflected market structure as much as market value. Simply put, Canadian producers often accepted lower prices because reaching other customers was difficult, expensive, or sometimes impossible. That issue became increasingly important as global demand for heavy crude evolved. Several refineries in Asia and other regions possessed the technical capability to process Canadian oil, yet moving significant volumes across the Pacific required export infrastructure that simply did not exist at the necessary scale. Without sufficient pipeline capacity to Canada's west coast, most barrels continued following the same familiar route south. For years, Canadian governments debated how to change that reality. Some argued that expanding export routes would strengthen Canada's bargaining position by creating access to global markets. Others questioned whether such projects could overcome environmental concerns, regulatory challenges, Indigenous consultation requirements, and the enormous financial costs associated with building major pipelines. Those debates stretched on for years, and several high-profile proposals were delayed, redesigned, or canceled altogether. Each setback reinforced the existing system. The United States remained Canada's overwhelmingly dominant customer, and American refiners continued benefiting from one of the most stable supply relationships in the global oil market. But markets rarely stay frozen forever. Recent investments in export infrastructure, combined with changing geopolitical conditions and renewed discussions about long-term energy security, have started reopening questions that many industry observers once considered settled. Canada's leaders are once again talking about diversification, not as a distant ambition, but as a strategic priority designed to reduce dependence on any single market. That does not mean the United States is suddenly disappearing from the picture. Far from it. The two countries remain deeply connected through pipelines, trade agreements, and decades of investment. But even a modest increase in Canada's ability to reach customers elsewhere could begin altering the balance of negotiations that has defined this relationship for generations. And that is exactly why the conversation has become so important. Because once a supplier gains options, even before those options are fully developed, the entire negotiating dynamic begins to change. The biggest shift may not be the volume of oil moving today. It may be the leverage both sides expect to have tomorrow. That brings us to the development that has changed the conversation. For years, discussions about Canada's energy future often ended the same way. Supporters of diversification argued that the country needed more export routes, while critics pointed to the enormous cost, political resistance, environmental concerns, and regulatory hurdles that stood in the way. The debate continued, but the underlying structure of the market barely changed. Most Canadian crude still flowed south, and American refiners continued operating under the assumption that this pattern would remain largely intact. Now, that assumption is being questioned. What has caught the attention of energy analysts is not that Canada has suddenly stopped exporting oil to the United States. That has not happened, and there is no realistic scenario in which it happens overnight. Instead, the focus has shifted towards something much more significant in the long run: Canada's determination to build more flexibility into its export system. In energy markets, flexibility can be just as valuable as production itself. Imagine two producers with exactly the same amount of oil. One can sell only to a single buyer. The other can choose between buyers in North America, Europe, and Asia. Even if both ultimately sell the same number of barrels, the second producer enters every negotiation from a much stronger position. Simply having alternatives changes the conversation before a single contract is signed. That is the strategic logic driving Canada's latest approach. Rather than viewing pipelines simply as transportation projects, policymakers increasingly describe them as economic infrastructure capable of reshaping Canada's bargaining position in global energy markets. The objective is straightforward: reduce dependence on one destination by increasing access to several. This shift has become even more important as global energy demand continues to evolve. Many refineries across Asia are designed to process heavy crude similar to the grades produced in Alberta. Countries throughout the Indo-Pacific remain major energy importers, and several have been searching for reliable long-term suppliers as global trade patterns continue changing. Canadian producers see those markets as opportunities that have been difficult to reach, not because demand was absent, but because transportation capacity remained limited. Every additional export route potentially opens another door. That doesn't automatically mean Canadian oil will replace supplies from the Middle East or Latin America. Global energy markets are highly competitive, and buyers compare price, reliability, transportation costs, and political stability before signing long-term agreements. But entering those conversations at all represents a meaningful change from the situation Canada faced for decades. This is where the implications for American refiners begin to emerge. Many refineries in the Midwest and parts of the Gulf Coast invested billions of dollars over several decades to process heavy Canadian crude efficiently. These facilities weren't designed around random global supplies. They were optimized for specific grades that arrived consistently through established pipeline networks. That reliability created one of the greatest advantages available to American refiners. Canadian oil was close, transportation costs were relatively low, and the supply relationship had become deeply integrated. Companies could plan years into the future with a high degree of confidence because the infrastructure connecting the two countries was already in place. But confidence and certainty are not exactly the same thing. The moment Canada begins demonstrating that larger volumes of crude could eventually reach overseas customers, refiners have to start asking new questions. What happens if Asian buyers are willing to pay more? What happens if future pipeline expansions allow Canadian producers to redirect additional exports toward Pacific markets? What happens if the price discount that American refiners have benefited from continues to narrow? These are not questions about tomorrow morning. They are questions about the next decade. And in industries that require investments measured in billions of dollars, planning often begins years before physical changes become visible. That is why executives throughout the refining sector closely monitor pipeline announcements, export data, shipping activity, and government policy. They understand that infrastructure shapes markets long before construction is complete. If producers believe they will soon have more options, their negotiating behavior changes. If buyers believe future competition for supply is increasing, their negotiating behavior changes as well. Sometimes the psychological impact begins before the economic impact fully arrives. We've already seen examples of this principle elsewhere in commodity markets. Whenever suppliers gain access to additional customers, pricing power tends to become more balanced over time. Buyers can no longer assume that existing discounts will remain permanent simply because they always have. That doesn't mean American refiners suddenly lose access to Canadian oil. Far from it. The United States remains Canada's largest customer by an enormous margin, supported by decades of shared infrastructure and one of the closest energy relationships anywhere in the world. Those fundamentals remain intact, but markets rarely react only to today's conditions.